In a quiet African village, a butcher's cheap meat hides a terrifying secret. When a couple's newborn is swapped for a disabled child, they uncover a dark conspiracy tied to the hospital. Can they expose the truth before it's too late? This chilling story of betrayal and justice will leave you speechless. Watch the full story to uncover the shocking truth. In the small village of Ashanti, there was one name that everyone knew. It was a name whispered with admiration and a touch of suspicion. Kofi. The man with a face that no one could forget, a face that bore the marks of hard work, age, and life's struggles. His features were sharp, his eyes intense, and his presence undeniably commanding. Though some villagers found his looks unsettling, there was one thing they couldn't deny: Kofi knew how to cook. Kofi ran the most popular shop in Ashanti. It wasn't a large store, but it was always bustling with customers. The shop, a modest building with a worn roof and a welcoming sign, had a wooden counter where Kofi sold meat and his famous pepper soup. The food was not just good, it was irresistible. The aroma of the spicy soup would drift through the village, drawing people in from miles away. Kofi's prices were something that no one could beat. His meat was cheap, so cheap that even the poorest villagers could afford a hearty meal. This was something that baffled the other sellers in Ashanti. They often looked at Kofi's shop with confusion. How did he manage to sell food at such low prices? Where did he get the meat? And why didn't the villagers ever question it? The village, nestled in a peaceful part of Africa, had a simple charm. The people were hardworking and close-knit, with their daily lives centered around the market, the small clinic, and the rhythms of farming and family. Ashanti had no luxuries or modern technologies, but the people were content. Or, at least, they thought they were. But behind the scenes, a dark secret was quietly growing. Ashanti had a private clinic, the only one in the village. The clinic was small and run by a group of doctors and nurses who appeared caring, always ready to offer help to the villagers. But there was something off about the clinic, something that no one dared to question, not even when whispers started to circulate. For years, women in Ashanti had been experiencing a strange, heartbreaking pattern. They would become pregnant with high hopes, praying for a healthy child. But more often than not, their dreams turned into nightmares. Babies would be born dead, or worse, born with twisted limbs and weak bodies that couldn't survive. This phenomenon left many parents devastated and unable to understand why so many children were born in such terrible states. Some villagers even began to believe that the land was cursed. One evening, an old woman gathered the others in the village square. "Maybe our land is cursed," she said, her voice trembling with fear. Another woman replied, "I think it's true. I've seen too many babies born this way. Something isn't right." Fear spread through the village like wildfire. Couples who had once dreamed of starting a family were now hesitant. Women were terrified to get pregnant. Many believed that the hospital was not helping them, it was only bringing misfortune. In the middle of all this, Rosie and Kwame lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of Ashanti. Rosie was a beautiful young woman, and Kwame, her husband, was a kind and devoted man. The couple had been married for 3 years and were excited to finally welcome their first child. Rosie's belly was swollen with the life growing inside her, and the anticipation was palpable. They had heard the rumors about the clinic, but they never believed them. They were hopeful, believing that their baby would be healthy. But little did they know, their journey would take a very different turn. It was a hot afternoon when Rosie went into labor. She had been feeling uncomfortable for the past few days, but this time, the pain was undeniable. Kwame was resting on a mat under a tree when he heard her scream. His heart raced as he leaped to his feet. Rosie stood in their small room, holding her belly, her face contorted in pain. "Kwame," she cried. "The baby is coming." Kwame rushed to her side, trying to comfort her. His hands shook with fear as he helped her outside. "Stay strong, Rosie," he said, trying to calm her. "We're going to the hospital." The village hospital was a small, private clinic that was known for its mysterious aura. People went there because there were no other options, but no one truly trusted the doctors. Still, it was the only place where they could go for help. Rosie groaned in pain as Kwame helped her walk through the village streets. The few villagers they passed stopped to watch, offering sympathetic looks. "She's in labor," one of them murmured. "I hope she's okay." When they finally reached the hospital, Rosie was rushed inside on a stretcher. The clinic was small and smelled of antiseptic. The nurses, who were usually kind, moved with an urgency that made Kwame uneasy. He held Rosie's hand tightly, trying to stay strong for both of them. Inside the delivery room, a doctor quickly took charge. "We'll take care of you, Rosie," he said, his voice steady but cold. Rosie's pain was unbearable, and the sweat poured from her body as she struggled to bring her child into the world. Kwame paced outside the delivery room, his heart racing as he prayed for a safe delivery. "Please, God," he whispered, "let our baby be healthy." But what he didn't know was that something far darker was taking place inside that very room. The nurses and doctors at the clinic had been part of a terrible conspiracy for years. Behind the scenes, they had been swapping healthy babies with disabled or sickly ones. They sold the healthy babies to those who needed them for dark rituals that the villagers had no idea existed. As Rosie's labor continued, the pain became too much for her to bear. She screamed with all her might, pushing with everything she had. The doctor and nurse encouraged her, urging her to keep going. "Just one more push, Rosie," the nurse said softly. "You're almost there." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. But it wasn't the cry that Rosie had expected. She fell into a deep sleep, exhausted from the delivery. When she awoke, everything seemed off. The nurse handed her a baby, but the child she held in her arms wasn't the one she had given birth to. It was frail and weak, a disabled child with no strength to move. Rosie's eyes widened in disbelief. "This isn't my baby," she whispered. "Where is my child?" The nurse didn't flinch. "This is your baby, Rosie," she said coldly. "This is what you gave birth to." Rosie shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, it's not," she insisted. "I saw my baby before I passed out. It was healthy. This isn't mine." Outside the delivery room, Kwame was waiting anxiously. He heard Rosie cries through the door, but when the nurse came out, she told him everything was fine. They had delivered a healthy baby. But when Kwame went to see his wife, his heart sank. The baby in Rosie's arms was not what he had expected. He looked at the nurse, confused and frantic. "This is not our baby," Kwame shouted, his voice rising with panic. "Where is our child?" The nurse, her face unreadable, stepped back. "This is your baby. There's no mistake," she said. But Rosie and Kwame both knew that something was horribly wrong. The tension in the air grew thick as they realized that the clinic, the very place they had trusted with their child's life, had betrayed them. What was happening here? What was going on behind the clinic's closed doors? And so, the first seed of doubt was planted. What would the villagers do when they found out the truth? Would they believe that the clinic, the only place that promised hope, was part of something far darker than they could have ever imagined? The following days in Ashanti were filled with questions and confusion. Rosie and Kwame couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. They had seen with their own eyes that the baby in Rosie's arms wasn't the one they had both dreamed of. They tried to speak with the nurses and doctors, but they were met with cold, dismissive answers. The more they questioned, the more it seemed like the clinic was hiding something from them. Every day, the weight of the mystery grew heavier on their hearts. Kwame couldn't sleep. Every night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what had happened. How could they have switched their baby? Why would anyone do such a thing? And most troubling of all, Where was their healthy child? Rosie, too, was consumed by grief and disbelief. She couldn't stop looking at the frail, disabled child in her arms. This wasn't the baby she had carried for 9 months. She had dreamed of holding her healthy baby, of watching him grow strong, but now all she had was this fragile little one. Every time she looked at the child, the pain in her chest intensified. "This is not my baby," she whispered over and over. "Where is my child?" But no one would give them answers. The clinic's staff kept telling them that the baby was indeed theirs. Even though everything in their hearts told them otherwise, they couldn't seem to get anyone to believe them. It felt as though the whole village was too scared to question the clinic, as though it was an institution above reproach. But Rosie and Kwame knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. One evening, after another sleepless night, Kwame decided they needed answers. He went to the village square, where the older men gathered to discuss village matters. Among them was Elder Kojo, a wise and respected figure in Ashanti, known for his knowledge and fair judgment. Kwame knew that if anyone could help them, it was him. "Elder Kojo," Kwame said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I need your help. Something is wrong at the clinic. Rosie and our baby was switched with another. They gave us a disabled child, but we saw our baby before the delivery. We know something is wrong. Please, you have to help us." Elder Kojo listened carefully, his eyes narrowing as Kwame spoke. He had heard rumors over the years about strange occurrences at the clinic, but he had always dismissed them. Now, hearing the urgency in Kwame's voice, he began to wonder if there was more to the story than he had realized. "We cannot let this go on," Elder Kojo said after a long pause. "You're not the first to suspect something, but no one has ever dared to speak out. The clinic is a place of trust, but perhaps it has become something else. I will speak to the other elders and make sure we investigate." The next day, the elders gathered at the village square. Elder Kojo shared Kwame and Rosie's story, and soon the others began to murmur. There were whispers of women who had lost their babies under strange circumstances, of children who had been born weak or disabled, but no one had ever connected the dots. Now, the truth was staring them in the face, and it was terrifying. "We must find out what is really happening in that clinic," one of the elders, Baba Kwaku, said. "We can no longer ignore the signs. If there is evil at work, we must expose it." A plan was set in motion. The villagers would secretly watch the clinic, keeping an eye on the staff's activities. But no one was prepared for what they would discover. Meanwhile, Rosie and Kwame returned home with the disabled child, still reeling from the shock of what had happened. They had no choice but to care for the child they were given, but their hearts ached with every passing day. They couldn't help but wonder what had become of their real baby. As days passed, the tension in Ashanti grew. Elder Kojo began asking questions at the clinic, but the nurses and doctors were evasive, offering vague answers. They insisted that there was nothing unusual happening at the clinic, but the villagers weren't buying it anymore. They wanted answers, and they were determined to get them. One evening, after weeks of quiet surveillance, the villagers finally decided to take action. A group of young men, led by Kwame, gathered in secret. They had been watching the clinic and had noticed strange things happening behind closed doors, hushed conversations, people sneaking in and out at odd hours, and a general sense of secrecy. The villagers could no longer stay silent. "We need to break in," Kwame said to the group, his voice steady with determination. "We need to know the truth." Elder Kojo, who had been quietly observing the developments, nodded in agreement. "You are right," he said. "But we must be careful. We cannot rush in without a plan. If we do this, we need to be ready for whatever we find." That night, under the cover of darkness, the group made their way to the clinic. The moonlight cast long shadows across the village, and the air was thick with anticipation. They crept around the back of the clinic, careful not to be seen. Kwame's heart was pounding in his chest. This was a dangerous mission, but he couldn't wait any longer for answers. He had to know what had happened to his child. They found a back door that was slightly ajar. Quietly, they slipped inside, moving like shadows through the darkened halls of the clinic. As they approached the delivery rooms, they could hear voices coming from the inside. The group stopped, holding their breath. Through a small crack in the door, Kwame peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The doctor and nurses were standing around a table, discussing something in hushed tones. On the table were two babies, one healthy, the other sickly and weak. The doctor was speaking in a low voice, but Kwame could hear enough to make out what they were planning. "Tonight, we switch them," the doctor said. "The healthy baby goes to the buyers. The disabled one stays here." Kwame's heart skipped a beat. It was worse than he had ever imagined. The clinic wasn't just negligent, it was part of a horrific trade, one that involved swapping healthy babies with sick ones and selling the healthy ones to the highest bidder. He felt sick to his stomach, his anger rising with every word he heard. "We have to expose this," Kwame whispered to the group. "Now." The group moved quickly, bursting into the room. The doctors and nurses were caught off guard, and in the chaos, they scrambled to cover their tracks. But it was too late. Kwame and the villagers had seen enough. "This is evil," Kwame shouted, his voice filled with fury. "You've been stealing babies. You've been selling them to people who want them for dark rituals." The nurses and doctors tried to deny it, but their lies were unraveling quickly. The villagers demanded answers, their voices rising in anger. "We know what you've been doing," Elder Kojo yelled. "You will pay for this." The clinic staff realized they were trapped. The walls of their deceit had come crashing down, and now, the villagers knew the truth. But the revelation was only the beginning. The story had only just started to unfold, and the darkness that had been hidden in Ashanti for so long was about to be fully exposed. Kwame looked around at the group of villagers, his heart racing. They had uncovered the truth, but now they had to decide what to do with it. Would they let the criminals escape, or would they stand up for the innocent lives that had been lost? Elder Kojo stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We must act now," he said. "This evil will not be allowed to continue. We will bring justice to those who have been harmed. And we will protect our children from any further harm." With the truth now exposed, the villagers prepared for the next step, bringing the perpetrators to justice and ensuring that the clinic's dark secret would never be hidden again. The village of Ashanti would never be the same, but they were ready to face the consequences of the evil that had lurked in their midst for far too long. The air in Ashanti was thick with tension the morning after the clinic's dark secret was exposed. The villagers, still reeling from the discovery, knew that their next actions would define the future of their community. The truth had come to light, and now, it was time for justice. But justice in Ashanti was not a simple matter. The village had a long history of upholding the law, and those who violated it faced the most severe consequences. Kwame and the group of villagers stood outside the clinic, the weight of their findings heavy on their shoulders. The once peaceful streets now buzzed with a mixture of anger and fear. The villagers had always trusted the clinic, but now they understood the evil that had festered behind its walls. They knew the people who had betrayed them, the doctors, nurses, and even Kofi, the butcher whose shop had always been a mystery to them. The time had come to bring the perpetrators to justice. But the villagers weren't just angry, they were heartbroken. So many innocent lives had been lost to this dark trade, so many families torn apart. The anger in the village was a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Elder Kojo knew that if they didn't act swiftly, the people of Ashanti would take matters into their own hands, and things could get out of control. "We cannot let them escape," Elder Kojo said solemnly. His voice was filled with both determination and sorrow. "We must bring them to the village square. There, we will decide their fate." The villagers rallied together, their faces grim with purpose. The clinic staff, including Kofi, were rounded up, their hands bound tightly as they were escorted through the streets. The crowd followed, their voices low but filled with undeniable fury. It was as though the entire village had united in their shared grief and anger. The crime they had uncovered had touched every heart, and no one was willing to let it go unpunished. When they arrived at the village square, the scene was set. The square, usually a place for joyful gatherings and celebrations, was now somber and filled with an air of heavy anticipation. The villagers stood in silence, waiting for Elder Kojo to speak. The criminals were lined up in front of the crowd, their heads bowed in shame, their faces pale with fear. Elder Kojo stood before them, his voice strong and unwavering. "You have betrayed the trust of this village. You have stolen the lives of innocent children. You have sold our future for your own greed. Today, we will not stand for this evil any longer." The crowd murmured in agreement. The anger was palpable, but Elder Kojo's voice kept them in check. He had always been the voice of reason in Ashanti, and now, he was the voice of justice. "Justice will be swift," Elder Kojo continued. "You will face the consequences of your actions, and no amount of pleading will change the truth. You have taken the lives of the innocent, and for that, you will pay." At that moment, the villagers began to chant in unison. Their words were clear and filled with resolve: "Justice. Justice. Justice." It was a chant that echoed through the village, a chant that would carry on long after the criminals had been dealt with. Kwame stood among the crowd, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. He had never imagined that his village, the place where he had grown up, could harbor such evil. But now, with the truth out in the open, he was ready to stand by his fellow villagers and ensure that this dark chapter would come to an end. One by one, the clinic staff and Kofi were brought forward. They had no defense, no excuses for their actions. The villagers were relentless in their pursuit of justice. There was no room for mercy in Ashanti, not when so many lives had been destroyed. As the final judgment was passed, the criminals were taken away. The villagers stood in silence, the weight of their actions heavy on their hearts. No one celebrated the punishment of the guilty. This was not a victory, it was a necessary act to protect the future of their village. But even in the face of this darkness, the village began to heal. The truth had been exposed, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. The villagers knew that they couldn't undo the pain that had been caused, but they could make sure that it never happened again. In the days that followed, the clinic was closed, and its staff was disbanded. The villagers set up a new system for healthcare, one that was transparent and rooted in trust. They built a new clinic, one that was open to scrutiny and built by the hands of the community. They made sure that no one, not even the most powerful, could hide behind lies again. For Kwame and Rosie, the road to healing was long. They still grieved for their lost child, the healthy baby they had dreamed of. But as they looked at the disabled child in their arms, they knew that they had made the right choice. This child, though different, was still their child. They loved him with all their hearts, and they would raise him with the care and love he deserved. Over time, more families came forward with their own stories of loss and grief. Some had lost their children at birth, while others had unknowingly been victims of the clinic's sinister practices. Together, the village began to heal. They embraced the surviving children and worked together to ensure that they grew up in a community that would protect them from harm. But the pain of the past would never fully disappear. The village had uncovered a truth so terrible that it could never be forgotten. The people of Ashanti had lost their innocence, but they had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect their own. They had learned that evil could lurk in the most trusted places, but it could also be exposed, confronted, and eradicated. The fire that had burned in the village square that day had not only consumed the criminals but had also symbolized the end of an era of darkness. Ashanti was no longer a village hidden behind ignorance and fear. It was a place where truth would always come to light, no matter how deep the darkness ran. As Elder Kojo stood at the edge of the village square, looking out over the crowd of villagers, he spoke one last time. "Let this day remind us of the cost of evil," he said, his voice filled with both sorrow and hope. "But let it also remind us that we have the power to change, to rebuild, and to protect our future." From this day on, we will never allow this darkness to return." The villagers nodded in agreement, their faces resolute. The fire that had consumed the clinic, the hospital, and the evil that had threatened to destroy their village, would never burn again. Ashanti was free. And with that freedom came a new beginning, one built on trust, unity, and the promise to protect their children at all costs. And so, the village of Ashanti moved forward, forever changed but stronger for it. The shadows of the past would always linger, but the light of justice and the love of their community would guide them as they built a future where evil would never again have a place to hide.